Welcome to the Landlord Profitability Playbook podcast, where we share the best practices we use to help our residential real estate investor clients automate their rent collection and get on with their lives. Check out the show notes at landlordprofitabilityplaybookpodcast.com. This show is brought to you by Roost Real Estate Company, Property Management. To learn more about the services we provide, visit investwithroost.com. Now, here's your host, Chris McAllister.
Welcome to the Landlord Profitability Playbook podcast, where it's my job to create and coach business opportunities and strategies that support and add value to real estate investors. I'm Chris McAllister with Roost Real Estate Company, and today I'm joined by our Director of Marketing, Laci LeBlanc. Good morning, Laci.
Good morning.
And a special guest, our Space Coast, Florida owner advisor, Rena Smith. Good morning, Rena.
Good morning.
Happy to have you join us from sunny Florida. So we're going to talk about investing in Florida today, and specifically the Space Coast of Florida. So when investors talk about Florida, they usually talk about it as if it's one thing. Florida is hot, literally, and from a marketing standpoint. Florida is booming. Florida is risky, or they think Florida is a gold mine. It really all depends on who you ask. But that way of thinking is exactly how investors unwittingly misprice risk, misunderstand their tenants, and end up frustrated with properties that don't behave the way they thought they would when they bought them. And it's all because Florida isn't one single market. It's a collection of very different regions with very different economic engines, renter profiles, and operating realities. And when you underwrite all of them using the same assumptions, whether it's population migration, real estate appreciation, tourism, short-term rentals like Airbnb and VRBO, you're not simplifying the decision. You're actually blinding yourself to how the market actually works. And today we're going to sort of narrow our lens and talk about one specific region that we know best, and that's Florida's Space Coast. So the Space Coast is Brevard County, and it actually extends, I think it's 72 miles, Rena. Does that sound right to you? From the southernmost point all the way up past Cocoa Beach to Cape Canaveral. So the reason it's called the Space Coast is our county, Brevard County, actually is where the rockets take off. So Florida's Space Coast. So what's different about this is it's not a retirement market. It's clearly not a resort market or a tourism-driven market. And it's definitely not a speculative flip first environment either. So the Space Coast economy is built on aerospace, it's built on defense, it's built on engineering, and it's built on year-round professional employment. And that reality shows up everywhere. It shows up in who rents the houses in the county, how long they stay in those houses, what they expect from those houses. And it also shows up in how quickly the market punishes poor execution, right? So if you've got people who expect to be here for 1, 2, 3, maybe more years as a renter, and you can't keep an appropriate house available for those folks at the price they're paying, quite frankly, you're going to lose them. And that's what we mean when we say that the market punishes poor execution. So we're going to ask Laci to sort of ask us some questions, Rena and I, and we're going to kind of break down what the Space Coast actually is, how it behaves, who's it for, and just as importantly, who shouldn't be investing in the Space Coast. So that's a lot to unpack, ladies. So I feel like I've already gone on for 20 minutes.
Well, let's start right at the top. So you just told us that most investors who are not familiar with this area talk about investing in Florida like it's one thing. Could be any number of things, but they talk about it like it's just one of those things. Tell me why that is such a dangerous assumption.
I think when people think of Florida, especially those of us in Ohio or in other areas of the country, Florida gets lumped into a single narrative that's driven by headlines. Sometimes those headlines are as simple as Disney World, right? They think all of Florida is Disney World. They think of it in terms of retirement and people moving to Florida from the snowy Midwest and Northeast. Maybe they think of it in terms of appreciation, vacations, whatever. But the problem is those types of forces, they don't apply evenly. And the Space Coast itself really isn't powered at all by tourism or retirees. Yes, we do have some tourism. Yes, we have some retirees, but it's really more like any other city or town anywhere else in the country that's powered by a given industry. And in this case, it's aerospace, defense, engineering, education. So what you have in the Space Coast are a lot of very, very well educated people. You have a lot of young families. I mean, my God, Rena, how many schools have we seen go up since we've been there the past few years?
Oh, there's numerous schools. There's so many people moving here, and they don't have enough school space for all the kids.
Yeah, I mean, since we've been there, my goodness, it's just crazy how much growth there has been since I think we started coming, gosh, as early as 2008, and then we bought our first house there in 2015, and you beat us there by a couple of years, right?
Yeah, actually, I moved here in '09.
Oh, no, nine. So you've been there, you've
2009,
seen it
yeah.
all. I mean, my God, the change from after the crash in '09 all the way to now, it's not even the same place. And yet it is the same place because it's still powered by the exact same economic forces. There's just more of it. So when you underwrite, if you look at the Space Coast of Florida as a real estate investor and you start to underwrite or think about what the value and what kind of return on investment you should get on a Space Coast property. But if you think about the Space Coast as you would South Florida or Tampa or Orlando or the Panhandle, you're going to make a massive mistake. You're going to misprice the risks. You're not even going to see the risks, and you're certainly not going to have a good sense of tenant behavior.
Yeah, I think you made a good point with Rena being on the ground every day. Chris, you're there. Roost is there. Obviously, Rena's our big Roost presence there. Chris, you're there every so often. You own there, so that's certainly insightful. But Rena, you are there each and every day. This is your home. Tell me from your perspective, how do people usually misunderstand the Space Coast when they first look at it?
Well, most people assume beaches and vacation rentals. What they don't see is that this is a working region. We have NASA, Space Force, and private aerospace employers drive year-round employment. People move here for jobs and quality of life, not just for the season.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's why I love it there, quite frankly. I mean, I love the beaches that we have there. They're public beaches, there's parking. It's just a very different vibe. But in terms of investing there, the difference shows up in everything. The length of the lease terms, how long people stay, how often they renew, what their maintenance expectations are, what the maintenance problems are, and even how fast problems can surface if you have an owner who doesn't keep up with preventive maintenance or starts to try to save some money and cut some corners here and there. I mean that whether it's the sun, the heat, the humidity, the bugs, or the tropical storms, there's there's a lot of things that can sneak up on you, and if you don't have that preventive maintenance mindset that you're willing to invest as you go, people can get hurt, and it sometimes scars them so much that they feel like they should sell and move to a quote safer place. But the reality is there's just so much opportunity here. You just have to be aware of all the things that go into successfully being a real estate investor here.
Honestly, it sounds to me, as somebody who's lived in Houston, it sounds more like Houston, Texas, than it does like Orlando. It sounds like more of that kind of market with that same kind of, professional drive. And I think that the renters might even be similar. So let's talk about the renters. Who actually lives in these homes long term?
Well, Rena, I think you can back me up on this, but our typical renter it's often a professional household, even in some of the lower dollar, maybe sub $2,000 a month rent, definitely in the $2,000 to $3,000 a month rent. It's professional households, engineers, defense contractors. Um, they call it military adjacent families. A lot of the families are dual income. But what's interesting is even in a lower priced 3 bedroom, 2 bath on a slab built in the 80s, you've got people who are, if not, have a master's degree and so forth. You have a lot of people with, a solid education, maybe a 2 year degree and so forth. And they're in businesses that directly support all of the engineering and defense contractors and so forth. And that's why, in the time that, we've been there, there's never been an unemployment issue in the Space Coast. I don't think there's ever been a time that people were worried about losing their jobs. Or, I mean, yes, there were some weird things that happened there, after the crash, back in 2008 and 9, there were things that happened with COVID, but this has just always been a very vibrant economy. And the people are there and they rent by choice. A lot of them rent by choice. They don't want to own, whether it's because they may get promoted and move out, or maybe it's just a lifestyle choice, but they rent by choice. They don't necessarily rent because they're stuck. And when you have people who want to rent versus buy, whether it's because of insurance rates or whatever, that means their expectations are higher, right? From a maintenance standpoint, from a service standpoint, but it also means that if you meet those expectations, they're going to stay. They're going to renew year after year after year.
Yeah, we have a lot of families with kids and people who care about the schools and the locations. Commutes and conditions are a big part of it. And it's not just bargain hunters.
It's interesting too what you said, Laci, about comparing this to Houston. I hadn't really thought of that. I actually met my wife Kelly in Houston and lived there myself for a couple of years, and it is very much like Houston in the mix of the economy. The other thing it reminds me of is Long Island, where you actually have coastal regions there, just like Houston, down south towards Galveston and so forth. But there's a lot of engineering and defense and manufacturing and so forth. So it's almost like what you hear about, like Detroit used to be, so to speak. Maybe there's not as much manufacturing, maybe it's more engineering and the manufacturing is done elsewhere, but we've got a little bit of both there. So I think that's one of the reasons why it's so vibrant.
Yeah, how is this like industry driven location different from the more retirement driven parts of Florida specifically that
I think so.
people think of when they think Florida?
I think you have people that come to the Space Coast and they want more. They want the American dream. It's aspirational, right? They're building for something. They're raising families. They want to move up in the world. They want to enjoy the good life, and the Space Coast allows them to do that. Whether it's proximity to the beach or proximity to Orlando and Disney World and all that. We're only an hour to Disney World from where we are, so it's kind of unique geographically, and obviously with all the kids and so forth, with fantastic zoos. And there's just, Rena, you had sports stuff with the kids every single day for, God, 18 years. But the other thing is, when you're in a typical resort area or retirement area, there is no vibrancy. You have people that in many cases are on a fixed income, even if they have some wealth that they're drawing on each month. It's more about sustaining where they are as opposed to growing and looking forward to a bigger future. And I honestly, of all the places I've ever spent time in or lived, I really feel like the Space Coast area of Florida, for the most part, those people are all looking forward to a bigger future for themselves and their family.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's going to compare the Space Coast to the Gulf Coast for a lot of
No.
reasons. But I do feel like, as someone who, when we go to Disney, right, we stay near Disney usually, but we take the hour-long trip out to see all of the Space Coast because we are nerds, really, is what it boils down to. But it feels the same as Houston to me because you're there for your life, right? But having the beach and having all of these cool features is a bonus, is an added perk, as opposed to moving to the beach and having the other things. It's just like a flip-flop there. So, I do think that could lead to some mistakes that investors could be making if they don't fully understand that. What are some of those mistakes? How does the cost of entering the Space Coast compare to other Florida markets and maybe to Ohio, since that's our other area, and kind of what mistakes do investors make after they buy or maybe before they buy?
I would say, as a rule, the entry costs to buy a house, the Space Coast, are definitely higher than Ohio on average. On the other hand, these days, when you look at a market like Columbus in Ohio, that's not a cheap market to get into relative to, a Springfield or Dayton. but the housing stock is obviously much, much newer in Florida than it is in Ohio. So net, I'm going to say on average, it's definitely a higher cost of entry than Ohio, but there still are areas in Columbus where it's probably comparable. But when you look at the Space Coast relative to, South Florida, Miami area, Tampa, Naples, the pricing is far more rational, right? And what you're paying for as an investor on the Space Coast is you're paying for economic and real income durability. It is complete. It's not about speculation. That economy has been doing incredibly well for years and years and years. And one other interesting thing is Florida is, people are always concerned about hurricanes, and there's been a ton of issues with insurance prices and so forth. But most of those insurance disasters have happened on the west coast of Florida, not on the east coast of Florida, and certainly not on the Space Coast. So what's interesting is, and if I had any wood here, I would knock on it, but the reason the United States government selected Port Canaveral as the place to shoot rockets off is because historically there's never been a direct hit of a hurricane at that Cocoa Beach, Cape Canaveral area. Yeah, we've had some high winds, we've had some fences come down and damage over the past few years that Rena and I have owned there, but it's just not as volatile. It's like this really sweet spot geographically that I guess makes it more predictable, if that makes sense. So if Ohio gives us yield and predictability almost across the state, the Space Coast, I would say, gives us some predictability relative to other areas of Florida. But the main thing about the Space Coast are those demographic and economic tailwinds and the quality of the income and the durability of the income for the people who live there. A house in Florida or properties in Florida versus properties in Ohio, especially where we work in Columbus, State, and Springfield, it's just, if you have a house in each of those portfolios, every one of those houses is going to do a different job. it's they all bring something different to the table. They bring different benefits to the table. It's just hard for me when I start talking about and getting excited about the Space Coast to find the downside on the Space Coast. Rita, we got to get another house down there. Let's get to work.
All right, I'm ready.
I volunteer to keep it up. You guys are so busy. Just, let me come down and we'll make sure everything goes well. Um, so I asked you a two-parter before. Let me reiterate that second part. I want to know about the mistakes that investors make, specifically when they buy on the Space Coast because of the misunderstanding that they have.
I'm going to deferred maintenance again. It gets punished fast. I mean, the sun is intense, right? We may not have direct hit hurricanes and massive flooding, but we still have tropical storms. We still have winds. It is hard to get insurance if you don't have a newer roof. I mean, basically around here, any roof that's more than 15 years old is often uninsurable. And the reason is that the roofs take a beating down here. The sun is hot, the wind is strong. And when there's a hailstorm that comes through, that can be devastating. So, you've got to maintain the property. You can't wait for the roof to start leaking before you fix it. You can't wait for the air conditioner to go south when it's 100 degrees in September and not, you got to have it serviced every single month. There's just so many pest control, termites, things like that. If you have a rental property, especially if it happens to be a multi-unit, you've got to invest in pest control. And that becomes a preventive maintenance thing, because if you let that go, you're going to have an infestation, you're going to have a disaster. If it's termites, it's different than if you're in Ohio and it's wintertime and the pipes freeze, right? It's a different set of problems, and it's almost all related to temperature and climate. But like a sloppy turn, any time somebody who's turning a house or is rehabbing a house starts to cut corners, it's just hard to explain, but man, it shows up really, really fast in a Florida market. Whereas, maybe some of the issues can stay hidden a little longer in other type of maybe places in the country, if that makes sense.
Residents are just looking for clean, well-maintained homes. They rent much faster or lease or whatever you want to say, but poor execution costs more than the people expect.
I mean, when you have a vacancy down there, Rena, how long does it generally take for you to find a qualified applicant down there?
Usually when something hits the market, I'll probably get 10, 12 applications with like in a week, and maybe two applicants are good
Yeah,
after you run background and checks like that. But we get
yeah,
quite a bit of activity. If the price is right, sometimes owners will want to try to rent honestly for more than what it's probably worth, but it just sets on the market for a lot longer to try to get that person that wants to pay that.
yeah. I would agree.
Yeah.
It's price sensitive, but the prices are a
Mhm.
lot higher.
Oh, they are definitely a lot higher.
But people are, they're incredibly well educated and they're very well
Hmm.
informed. I mean, they can look up what rental properties are going for in a given
Yeah.
area
Yeah.
just as much as we can. And when you have an owner for whatever reason, whether they pay too much for it up front or whatever, and they either just want to get more or they have to get more. In either case, my gosh, the even more so than in Ohio, I think the prospective applicants slash the market punishes that kind of behavior
Yeah.
really quickly and really obviously.
I had not even considered the sun and how much hotter it is and how what a difference that might make for
Mhm.
maintenance. And we talk a lot about maintenance, so it's always top of mind, but that never crossed my mind. We have a neighborhood here that faces like due east, and none of the homes have just a simple, awning or a porch on the front. So all of their front doors are constantly, they look 15 years
Shaded.
older than they are because they're in direct sunlight for the first, half of the day. And they they rent for less, right? When we were looking for a home to buy, we avoided that neighborhood entirely because even though the homes are really nice inside, and we could see that on Zillow or wherever we were looking, on the outside, they don't look as nice, and the whole neighborhood suffers because of it, because of the poor maintenance and there are a lot of rental properties in that neighborhood. And because, I guess poor planning, right? Facing them all in that direction and giving none of them sun protection. But I just think that's really interesting and something that people probably don't think of because I
Yeah.
think of this stuff for a living and that didn't occur to me. So I think that's a really good point about, knowing the market and what mistakes you could make. But one thing that you guys keep talking about is management discipline. Why does management discipline matter? Like, what is that? Define it for me for people who are listening, but also why does it matter so much here specifically on the Space Coast?
Again, huge professional people, professional tenant base, right? These are people who, in many cases, are renting by choice. They expect to pay, fair market value for the property, but in return, they expect communication from the property management or the owner. They expect them to be responsive. They expect the condition to be at the neighborhood standard, if not above. And the one thing about Florida and the neighborhood standard tends to go up over time, and it's obvious that it's going up over time. Whereas a lot of the neighborhoods in Ohio and the Rust Belt tend to be more stagnant. The market rewards operators, owners, landlords who run their rentals like a business, that they don't run it like a hobby. I would say that, I'm sure we have our share of quote accidental landlords, in the Space Coast area, people who, for whatever reason, ended up with an extra house, whether it was from an inheritance or something like that. And I don't have anything, in the middle of this podcast to back it up. I will tell you that I don't think that they don't stay landlords long, because you've got to be intentional about it, or you've got to have professional help and you've got to be willing to pay for it. The other thing that's interesting is, and I think, Rena, you've got this nailed. Why do you think you are the five-star Google review queen here at Roost Real Estate Company? So if anybody wants to check out Roost down in the Space Coast, you'll see our Google reviews are just outstanding there. But why do you think reviews matter so much? I guess reviews matter everywhere, but it just feels like, I guess it feels like if when in Florida, they either really, really love you or they don't even bother. Is that fair?
Yeah, reputation travels fast, in smaller professional communities. Your name gets out there and your company name gets out there, and they see what you're doing and they see your reviews, and it really does matter.
I think it matters dramatically, and I think it speaks to a huge degree about how well you do your job and how professional you are. I mean, my God, those reviews are just incredible, and they just keep popping up every single week. I see another new 5-star review for Rena, so thank you very much.
Yeah, and they're not just from owner clients, right? So as a property management company, we've got two clients. We've got our owner clients and then we've got our tenant clients. And in this market, it feels like because there is that professional tenant base that expects the communication and the responsiveness, that for an owner, the tenant reviews matter as much as the other owner reviews. So if you're considering property management in this area, look for other owner reviews, but also look for the tenant reviews because those matter here more than potentially other places, just because of the professional tenant base, like you mentioned. So, and you do a great job on both of them. Obviously, we're really proud of those, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention it as the marketing person on the call. But moving forward, let's talk about who should and who should not be investing in this space. Because Chris, you mentioned that this plays a different role. The properties in this area can play a different role in the portfolio than, say, properties in Ohio. So who shouldn't be investing in the Space Coast with their portfolio in mind?
Any investor who's looking to buy, is just looking for the cheapest possible way to get into the market or the cheapest possible deal should not be wasting their time looking in Florida, right? If you're an owner who if you're an owner who doesn't have the discipline to take some of that rent money and put it, set it aside for reserves, Florida is not going to be the market for you. You've got to be willing to look at the market as you've got to maintain the house. And we've already, talked about all the reasons you've got to maintain the house. And, maybe you certainly won't get the same amount of monthly cash flow on a house in Florida as you would say from a house in Springfield, Ohio. But what you will get if you fund the reserves, if you don't let deferred maintenance get out of hand, if you keep up with the house, when it does come time to sell that property, to liquidate that property, the appreciation that you're going to enjoy is just going to make it all worthwhile tenfold, right? Again, who's it not for? If you're chasing a cheap deal, if you're not going to fund reserves, if you're not going to take care of the house, if you're looking for, just to be completely hands off and just let it run by itself without any, infrastructure or professional management, I just have to be honest, you're going to lose.
So that leads me to my very obvious next question, which is who is this market ideal for? Who should be investing in the Space Coast?
You got to be looking at it for the long term. And I preach that constantly. We're always in it for the long game. You've got to be, a portfolio builder, right? If you're looking to have multiple homes, you may not want to have all of your eggs in one basket on the Space Coast. Maybe you do want to have homes in, Ohio and Florida, or maybe there's other parts of Florida, or maybe you want to mix in your portfolio of short-term rentals and long-term rentals. The point is, you have to be intentional. And the other thing is, there's, again, I love the Space Coast, but I never thought of it that it was overhyped or sexy, right? The Space Coast area is for owners who value predictability over hype, and they value execution over, just setting it and forgetting it, because that never works. So you got to do the work or hire somebody to do the work, but the rewards and the predictability, the income, I just absolutely believe are second to none.
So if for listeners, what would you say is the one thing that they should remember about the Space Coast?
Well, I would say that it's not one market, right? The Space Coast behaves differently because it's built on real employment, it's built on families, and it's built on long-term demand. Yes, you've got the same percentage of retirees as any other city in the country does. And there are some, vacation rentals, and there are people who go on vacation there. But I would also argue that the people who go to vacation there do so because of proximity to family who already lives there. So if you understand the type of tenant that lives on the Space Coast, if you understand their behavior and you're prepared to invest accordingly, my gosh, homes in the Space Coast, they can just play a huge role in a diversified portfolio. And I know it's played a huge role in my personal portfolio with the couple of houses that we have down there.
Yeah, I think that's one place where we have a unique connection, right? We actually have a little pop-up on our site if you go visit our site that talks about how Roost is the connection between Ohio and Florida's Space Coast, and being able to look at, again, as a property manager, a variety of portfolios and see how properties in these areas are, which roles they're playing for different investors, I think is a really unique place to come from. And I think that's why we don't necessarily hear other people talk about Florida in this way. When other property managers, when people talking to real estate investors address Florida, they do talk about it like it's all Airbnbs, right? And it's all short term. So I think that being at Roost obviously puts you in a unique position to talk about both. Earlier in this season, we talked about how Ohio isn't safe. It's predictable. Investing in Ohio isn't safe. It's predictable. Today we've talked about Florida and the Space Coast as something very different than people expect. Can you connect these two ideas for our listeners as the expert and the connection between Ohio and Florida?
Yeah, and again, I think the common thread is market behavior. By market behavior, we actually mean what the people who live there expect, right? In the Ohio episode we just did, we talked about how markets like Columbus, Dayton, and Springfield behave in very different ways, even though they're, in the same state and literally maybe 75 miles apart on Interstate 70. But Florida to some degree works the same way. The mistakes investors make is treating markets as interchangeable instead of understanding the role each market plays, right? So uh, just like there's differences between Columbus, Dayton, and Springfield, and it's very close together, there's differences in Florida all over the place. And again, I keep coming back to the Space Coast is one of the most unique places that I've ever found in Florida. So at our company, at Roost Real Estate Company, we think in terms of portfolio construction. We don't think in terms of isolated deals, right? Our sweet spot is helping people go from, one house to 10 houses to 20 houses, right? It's about people who want to build a portfolio for the long term, and we're uniquely equipped to help people do that. But when you just to try to bring home the last couple of episodes between the Ohio market and the Florida market, Columbus, Ohio is about liquidity and long-term growth, and it's not forgiving on the front end. If you miss buy, it takes years to make up for it, but it does give you exit options and it gives you appreciation over time. Dayton, Ohio is about stability. It smooths cash flow out and rewards consistency more than speed. And Springfield is about yield and execution discipline, right? You can make really great monthly cash flow in Springfield if you're a good operator. So Springfield is about current cash flow each month, less about long-term appreciation. But if you're in Springfield magnifies decisions, whether they be good decisions or they really be bad decisions, because you just don't have that appreciation-driven forgiveness. And the Space Coast, does something altogether. Space Coast is a fourth market after Columbus, State, and Springfield. It brings demographic tailwinds and it brings income quality because it's driven by real employment, professional households, long-term demand. It's not about tourism. It's not about speculation. It's just predictability of a different kind than we talk about Ohio being predictable. So I think when our investors, understand how each of these markets behave, they can combine, properties in each market very, very intentionally, right? So if you're in Ohio, those properties tend to help control risk. They help control cash flow. Buying on the Space Coast enhances income durability and demand quality, but together, you put that stuff together, it reduces overall volatility of the portfolio in a much better fashion than if you decide that you're going to buy all of your houses in Springfield or all of your houses in the Space Coast. I think there is real value in intentionally spreading that portfolio around. And again, we are in a unique position to help people do that.
Yeah, I think that people see a risk to investing in different locations, right? If you're in Ohio, you want to invest in Ohio. If you're in Florida, you want to invest in Florida. If you're investing in Ohio and Florida, you can't be both places unless you're you, I guess. But so I think people see that as a risk sometimes. But what I'm hearing from you is that the potential reward for investing in these different markets is big,
Yeah,
worth considering.
Absolutely. And I will also say, when we first got to Florida, I had a long-term client who's still a client and a great friend in Ohio that when he found out we were coming to the Space Coast and he was doing a 1031 exchange, I think they bought 10 or 12 houses, that first year that we were licensed down there. And
Yeah.
Rena still manages those houses for them and they still live in Ohio. And then, my friend Johnny, who used to run stores with me at Target on Long Island years and years ago, he's bought a couple of houses down there in the Space Coast that he still owns. And so there is a thread, count me as the third person we know. Of course, Rita's been in both markets. That when you have the right management, when you've got a five-star operator like Rena on the ground, you can invest in Florida and Ohio and still sleep nights. So I guess that's my final pitch there, Laci. How did I do from a marketing perspective?
Fantastic. Couldn't have written a script for you that was better than that.
All right, Rena, anything else today?
No, I think everything was pretty much covered. This was great.
Okay. Laci, that it for today?
Sounds good to me. I'm excited to get this out there and for people to dig deeper in the possibilities that the Space Coast has to offer them.
All right. Well, anybody listening who wants a deeper written breakdown, we've got a blog post out there at Learn with Roost, and we'll put the link in the show notes about investing in the Space Coast. And if you missed our previous episode that we did for the Landlord Profitability Playbook podcast called Investing in Ohio Isn't Safe, It's Predictable, and That Matters, we'll have that link in the show notes as well. And if you'd like to learn more about how we work with investors, you can check us out at investwithroost.com. Thanks, everybody, and we hope to be speaking to you again soon.